is Janet Hinchy, and she comes all the way from the Ocala National Forest, not too far from here, which is a very interesting system. For those of you who aren't familiar with it, I think you'll hear about some different types of trees than what you might think of when you think about the piney woods in Florida. Janet Hinchy has been the silviculturist at the Ocala National Forest for, well, since 1983, I believe. And she's going to talk today about management of longleaf pine on her forest.
Okay, I'm going to talk about the management of longleaf pine on the Ocala National Forest. Our national forest was established in 1908. It's the oldest national forest east of the Mississippi River, and one of the few national forests. Let's see, which is the corner button? The red?
I think that,
Yeah, the red. It's one of the few national forests east of the Mississippi that was created out of public domain land, like almost all the western forests were. So our original forest was this yellow ridge. We were 198,000 acres when we were established, and through acquisitions, the green area, we've grown to 385,000 acres. We're located in sort of north central Florida, right here. It took me an hour to get here, so it's an hour north of here. Our longleaf forest, we have two kinds of longleaf forest, and just a note too. Within the forest, the big white area is sandpine scrub, and that is most of our forest. About 70% is sandpine scrub. We do have some longleaf pine, both uplands and flatwoods. If you're not, the uplands is what we call uplands is kind of some sandy rolling hills, Florida rolling hills. And then the flatwoods are much higher water table and very, very flat. We have about 50,000 acres of each of those. Okay, the management of our longleaf pine is directed by two things. First of all, forest plan. All the national forests have a forest plan. Ours was completed in 1999. What it did was set an adaptive approach to maintaining and restoring ecosystem health of all the ecosystems we have, including longleaf pine. As far as silviculture, it established that we would manage our longleaf pine through uneven age management rather than even age. And it set up management areas, of which we have 3. Red-cockaded woodpeckers are present on all the national forests in Florida, all 3 of them, and it's a big part of our management. It's a federally endangered species, and they thrive in the longleaf pine forest. So one of the management areas is where they're present. Another management area is where they're present, and we also have cattle grazing. We don't have any cattle grazing on the Ocala anymore. The last grazing allotment closed in 1983. But the other national forests still have some. And then we have another management area where there's no red-cockaded woodpeckers present and no cattle. And so the management varies a little bit in these different areas. The other thing that drives our management is an ecological condition model that was completed in 2011. This ecological condition model is based on 3 components of the longleaf forest. First, the overstory, or the forest canopy, and that's the longleaf pines. Secondly, the mid-story, kind of the middle layer of trees. And then the third one is ground cover. For the ecological condition, each component is assessed as to how close it is to its desired future condition that we've established. The overall condition is then a combined value for each of the different components. A good or a fair value would suggest that we want to maintain that just through a maintenance mode. Poor, very poor, and some of the fair values represent that we want to do some type of restoration. And the restoration that we do may be just for one component. So we set our priorities using this model. This is just a close-up of sort of the top part of the longleaf forest. The green, very light green areas are in good condition. The yellow areas are in fair condition. This sort of orangish is poor, and the reddish are very poor. And just another part of our forest down in the south end. One thing I would point out, now the green areas, they're very light green on this slide. Those are areas that we're just doing maintenance, which for us is our prescribed burning. The yellow areas is where we do a lot of our work because it's really important to us. And sometimes we just have to do maybe some heavy maintenance or very light, inexpensive restoration. And it's very important to us that all of that yellow area doesn't change to a poor condition. So we do a lot of work in there. I also should mention that these little red triangles, those are active red cockaded woodpecker trees. Also, I will point out that in both the slides, most of the orange and the red, the poor and the very poor condition, is in our flatwoods forest. By far, our upland longleaf forest is in better ecological condition than our flatwood forest. So our restoration goals, first of all, the overstory. What our desired condition is, we want to have mature longleaf pine forest with multiple age classes. For the mid-story, and this is actually examples of not our desired condition, because what our desired is for the oak mid-story to be present, but in a very low basal area or percent cover. So what the kinds of things we're looking to do is to reduce the density of oak and eliminate sandpine, which is a huge competitor and encroacher on our longleaf sites. For the ground cover, our restoration goal, what's desired, is to have an intact, healthy, native species, pyrogenic ground cover. So what we're usually looking at is restoring the abundance of what we have or the species diversity. So some of the treatments that we might do, and I'm going to start with the overstory. First of all, natural regeneration. If we have plenty of seed-bearing longleaf pines present, which we do in this slide, then, and we have frequent prescribed fire, which this is an area where we have fire about every 2 years, and the ground cover is predominantly herbaceous, which it is in this area, then we can manage quite easily for natural regeneration. The openings, because then we just have small openings within the forest, they seed in quite well, and under those conditions, it just happens with what our normal management is. Now, if we don't have those things, if we don't have the longleaf trees present, or it's not being burned frequently, then we have to do some artificial regeneration. And a lot of times it requires harvesting an off-site overstory species, which for us, it might be sandpine, it might be slash pine, and it might be loblolly pine. So we harvest off the big trees, and then we do our site preparation, trying to simulate that seed bed that occurs under natural fire-driven regime. So the site preparation it's got to be pretty clean. We do all our planting by hand, and these were some little trees that were planted just last week. Now, some other treatments we do for the two other components, and this set of treatments that I'm going to talk about next actually addresses both things. It restores mid-story conditions and restores the ground cover when the species are present, just suppressed. Most of our forests, we have the ground cover species there, but we have a lot of acres where they're suppressed. Sometimes when we first started doing this, I would think, I'd look at an area like this and think, we don't have the ground cover. But once we removed the mid-story, it appeared, because I wasn't seeing it before. There would be just maybe a small little blade. I didn't realize the huge root system that was underneath that. They just needed to be released. And they seemed to persist for a long time. So one of the things that we use is mowing. These are 3 different mowers. Oops. We use both the, this would be the most inexpensive, but only works for really small brush. It's a rear mounted, it's almost like just a giant bush hog. We use the front mounted, this is a double mower. It can do a lot heavier material, plus in the heavier, denser, it works better if the mowers are on the front of the equipment. And then this is the vertical drum mower, where the drum actually rotates this way, and it will chip it down to just little bitty chips if you want that if you want to do that with your mid-story that you're removing. It's a little more expensive and it's a little slower. So this is an area where basically the fire got away from us. It was an area that was being prescribed burned, but it went for maybe 5-6 years where it did not have an adequate prescribed burn, and the oak mid-story really got away from us. So this is what it looked like before, and of course with the mowers, that's what it looked like after. We did some planting, filled in some of the holes that we found, and now we can manage, because the oaks do sprout back, but we can manage it through our regular fire program. This is another one. In this case, what the before was sand pine that had encroached and become a really thick mid-story. Then we mowed it, we burned it, we planted it, and what you see on the right is 5 years later, and the longleaf pine were planted in 2008, so they're about 5 years old now. So, and this is exactly what we want to achieve. We've got our desired conditions. It takes a little bit of time. It's not a mature longleaf forest yet, but it's well on its way, and all we have to do is maintain it through our regular burning program. Another treatment that we use is, and we just call it dozer pushing. Mowing can be expensive, so we came up with this as a less expensive treatment when we didn't have the density of oaks that you saw in some of those last slides, but where we still have way too many oaks. In this situation down at the bottom, there was about 120 oaks per acre, 2 to 5 inches in diameter. What's desired in a mature longleaf forest for us is 5 to 10. So it's still way too many oaks, and over time they develop more and more leaves, more and more crown, and shade out the ground story. The longleaf pines in this stand, there was about 180 of them per acre, and it was 37 years old. The way the dozer pushing works is, we use our fire tractor, and that's the little tractor right here. This is the one that pulls our fire plow, and for both prescribed burning and fire control. And what we found is these oak trees, because this area has been burned regular, but it just doesn't kill the oaks. These little turkey oaks get almost as fire resistant as the longleaf pine as they get to this size. But they're weakened at the base. The roots are not strong. And with this small dozer, the operator can really just tap the tree, and it comes over. It doesn't uproot. It just breaks at the base of the stem or at the very top of the roots, and we can get rid of those oaks a lot cheaper than we can through a mowing operation. This is another example, a little bit heavier oak cover. This is before the treatment, and again, the herbaceous cover is sparse to absent, a lot of leaves on the ground. It burns, but you don't get a response because there's still a lot of shade and root competition. And then this is just a year and a half after treatment. We do get some weedy species, but we also get a real good response of the wiregrass. These are just wiregrass that were already there that responded once we got rid of that oak cover. And then another treatment that we do, and this one really is just for the ground cover, but even when you have, this is a longleaf pine plantation, but even the longleaf pine, if they're too thick, can shade out the ground cover. And we want to manage for an open pine stand. So in this case, we did a pre-commercial thin where we went in and just by hand they cut down, selected smaller trees. Now, if we don't have the species, if the species are lost, then we do some seed collection. We have a flail vac ourselves. We have a lot of areas that are good for seed collection because we do the growing season burning, and we have lots of mature forest with a very undisturbed understory. We don't have a lot of situations where we need to seed, but one of them is old fields, and we do have some old bahia grass and hairy indigo. So the first thing that we have to do, and we haven't even tackled the biggest field that we have because it costs, is get rid of that bahia grass and hairy indigo. But we also have a need, and we sometimes seed and sometimes plant old roads. We have a lot of roads on our forest that we've been trying to establish a road system and get rid of all the rest. We have a lot of user-created roads. There were some years, 5-10 years ago, when we had a huge problem with unmanaged vehicle recreation. Four-wheelers, motorcycles, UTVs, Jeeps, Everybody wanted to come out to the Ocala National Forest and create their own trails, and we've finally gotten to where we're trying to shut that down. And these roads, and again, sometimes we plant, because as Zach said, you can get that more immediate, now it's vegetated. And sometimes we seed it because it's a lot cheaper to do that. And our most important thing that we do is our prescribed burning. This maintains and restores all three components of the longleaf pine forest. What we're doing in the sandhills is we try to burn every 2 years, and we're pretty much there in the sandhills. In the flatwoods, we try to do it every 3 to 4 years, but we're not there yet. We're still working. Those burns are a lot more complex, and there's a lot more urban interface with those burns. We also, real important that we follow the mowing and dozer push treatments with the fire, because the oaks do sprout back, and the fire helps suppress some of that sprouting. And then generally, we're burning about 25,000 to 40,000 acres a year. So in summary, the desired future condition for our longleaf pine that we're trying to manage for is to have a longleaf pine forest with multiple age classes, oak mid-story present but low in numbers and cover, and then an intact, healthy, native species, pyrogenic, herbaceous ground cover. And this would just be an example of what we're trying to manage for. So thanks, and is there any questions? Yes?
Have you all done any genetic analysis of longleaf pines in certain areas versus other areas?
Well, we have. It's a fairly old study, and seed source, which is, so when we do our planting, we contract the seedlings that are grown, but we actually provide our own seed, because we maintain seed in our Forest Service Nursery Mississippi from different areas. Generally, you either use a local source in the zone you're in, or you can go one zone north. So on the Ocala, because we don't really have a local seed source, we can use seed from South Georgia, North Florida, but we would not want to get seed from Louisiana or North Alabama or something like that. So
The only reason I asked the question, I know in shortleaf restoration, western Missouri and stuff like that, when they got into the germplasm, it all got crazy because they were finding loblolly genes in with shortleaf and so forth that over time it migrated out of Texas up into Missouri. So the concept of there was this pure gene pool got all blown away.
Yeah, we just basically stay in those zones because years ago they found it just doesn't grow as well. And I've seen some examples of in older plantations where there obviously was not a good seed source. So.